Thank you so much for having me, Tom. Appreciate it. Thank you all so much for having me today. I get to talk about the fun topic of education funding, something that I know no one cares about very much. So I'm very, very excited. I want to talk about the Oklahoma funding formula. I have a full presentation on this. It takes about 30 minutes. It's as boring as it sounds, so I will keep it as brief as I can. Essentially, what the funding formula is designed to do is to equalize district funding throughout the state. Essentially, what that means is that districts that have a lot of local property tax money get less in state funding so that there's more left over for those that don't have as much local funding for their districts. Now, what that means for districts that have these wind farms, for example, I'm using Kay County and Caddo County. Here's kind of what happened after that wind farm became operational in Caddo County. There's a lot of numbers up here I'll talk through so it's not as overwhelming as it looks. But essentially what you see here is a modest increase in local funding between 2019 and 2023. Likewise, you see a drop in state funding. Now, again, to remind you all, the formula funding doesn't encompass all state funding. That's why I have the formula category over off to the right. That's not included in the total. That's just a portion of the state funding. But again, you see a modest increase in local funding, a decrease in that state funding, primarily driven by a decrease in the funding formula money because of that offsetting in local taxes. Now, I have to point out the federal funding, you saw a huge spike, and this is a lot of that COVID money that came in through the federal government. It's still in our school systems right now. It's still kind of coming through. So that number is for sure going to be coming down, which is important to note because in Caddo County's case in particular, you saw a small decrease actually in per pupil funding between those times. And if you didn't have the federal funding up there like you do, this massive increase, that would be even worse for them, unfortunately. And then I have the state averages just to compare and contrast how the states here compared to the county itself. Obviously, essentially the same local funding that you've had for the last 4 years. The state funding's actually been down. I want to comment on that as well, which may not make a lot of sense to you who have been noticing how much money the state legislatures have been putting into education over the last few years. The reason that that number's actually been decreasing over the last 4 years is primarily due to the inflation increases. Unfortunately, the Biden administration has continued to spend a crazy amount of money, which has driven that inflation in double digits for years now, and that's primarily why, despite the fact that we've been able to increase funding education over the last few years by quite a bit, over $500 million last year, you've still seen a decrease when you adjust that for inflation. And again, all these numbers are adjusted for inflation, for those who are wondering. In Kay County, this wind turbine became operational in 2015. You actually see a massive increase in local funding here, but again, you see a huge decrease in state funding. Federal funding is a little bit more modest compared to Caddo, that's still a pretty big increase as well. But again, if you look at it, again, a huge amount of local funding, an increase, but at the end of the day, it still essentially grew as fast as the state did. So, despite the fact that you have this massive increase in local property tax dollars, it's not like it's just a giant windfall where you get all of that money. Because there's a decrease in state funding, you end up better off, but not necessarily any different than how the rest of the state's been doing when you add up all of these local sources. And again, another important point to note is even when you do get this increase in local funding, a lot of that local property tax money has strings attached to it. The state funding itself is essentially just general operating money. The district can spend that however they want, primarily on salaries, textbooks, all the things that you can think about. Normally, the property tax money in particular is heavily restricted for the most part to capital expenses. That means buildings, facilities, upgrades, maintenance, things like that. So you can't actually spend a lot of that on teacher salaries, which has been something that we've at OCPA tried to get changed before, because there's quite a few districts in the state that actually don't have any state funding at all, and primarily they're essentially forced to spend money on things they don't want because they have so much local money. They can only do so much for their teachers, where their teachers might be making a little bit more on the state average, but they could be making a whole lot more if they were given more freedom. So even if you do see a case like this where you've got a huge increase in local funding, it doesn't necessarily mean that you can start giving back to your teachers, buying all sorts of things for your students. It's primarily going to be essentially forced to spend on either new buildings, maintaining new buildings, which isn't a bad thing. But at some point, you can only build so many buildings, build so many new football stadiums, and things like that. And this is essentially just reiterating the point. This shows you how the share of education funding in the counties changed compared to the state before the wind turbine, and then after, you see a rise in the county, depending on local tax dollars, a lot more, whereas the formula number, as you can see, is now only essentially a quarter of their total funding after the fact. The same thing for K County. There's actually more drastic, where they almost had a third of their funding originally through the state aid. And yes, they saw, again, a huge shift in how that money was allocated, but at the end of the day, it resulted in a somewhat similar increase compared to the state average when all is said and done. So that's all I've got. Happy to take questions after this as well. I'll be in the back if anybody wants to chat as well about it and write down the questions. So thank you all so much for having us.